Hi, it's Rachel, and as part of scaling up our garden this year in a big way, we have changed up our raised bed design. In prior years, we have always built them out of wood, but we have graduated to using concrete block. I wanted to talk through why we made that change, the pros and cons, quick description of each approach, and finally how our decision to really scale up growing our own food affected the way that we thought about those choices and the relative value of each of those different pros and cons. I knew I wanted to stick with raised beds due to the heavy clay soil on our property and the importance of spring drainage. My goal was to create 10 blocks of growing area, 8 feet by 24 feet in size, with an access aisle down the middle, probably around 8 inches in depth. As we decided how to build them, 3 main considerations drove the choice: cost, adaptability, and the time and effort to execute. Cost is always a factor, of course, but especially given that we were scaling up the garden, the relative cost of the two approaches became even more important. On the cost front, the concrete block approach did have a slight advantage, about $50 per bed. Because I am going to be creating 10 of these bed kind of block areas, that was a total of $500, and $500 is a significant amount of money. Let me show you how we got to those numbers for each approach, and note that this is using Home Depot pricing in July of 2023. That's what's driving these prices. I'll start with our old construction method of using dimensional lumber. I assumed 2x8 lumber to get to about 7 1/4 inches of depth, close to my 8-inch goal, and I assumed pressure treated lumber that was rated for ground contact. For the long edges of the growing areas, I would need either 12 pieces that are 8 feet long or 6 pieces that are 16 feet long. Either way, that adds up to about $132. The short edges would be around 3 feet long, and I've learned from experience that I need to have these pieces not just on the ends, but also cross-bracing pieces roughly every 8 feet or so. Otherwise, the long sides of the beds tend to bow outwards under the weight of wet soil. I would need 8 total of those approximately long 3 feet pieces, and the most efficient way to do that and avoid wasteful cuts is to buy 2 12-foot long pieces for another $33. I've ignored the cost of screws for now, since most of us have those on hand, but the other thing I learned the hard way with these beds is that you do need kind of an L-shaped bracket at the corners to help hold them square and straight. Otherwise, you can get quite a bit of twisting and warping as the years go by. Those go in the outer corners and on both sides of the cross brace pieces for a total of 24 that I need, and 4 packs of those corner braces come to $31. I use floating row cover on top of 1/2-inch PVC arches in multiple places throughout the garden, either as pest protection or as some needed shade in the hotter months, and I knew the design needed to accommodate those. My prior approach with the wood beds was to use a 1/2-inch pipe hanging strap that I screwed onto the inside faces of the bed. The arches are placed every 8 feet for a total of 14 across an entire 8-foot by 24-foot block. Because each arch needs 2 strap hangers, I have a total of 28 for each of these growing blocks. They're sold in packs of 10, so I would buy 3 for a total of $12. Altogether, that comes to $208 for each of these growing blocks at today's current prices. Moving on to the new method of concrete blocks. The blocks are 16 inches long, 8 inches wide, and 8 inches tall. That 16-inch dimension means that 3 of them together add up to 4 feet, and I end up needing 18 on each long side of the growing area to get to my 24-foot dimension. The blocks are a bit under $2 each for a total of $72. Now, I realized I needed an odd number of CMU blocks at each of the short ends of the bed. I'll explain why in a second, but my choice came down to either using 5 at each end and getting a 7-foot wide bed, or 7 at each end and ending up with a 9-foot wide bed. I didn't have enough space to take every single one of my 10 beds and add a foot to it, so I decided to go with the narrower 7-foot wide option, and that means 5 blocks at each of the short ends of the bed for a total of 10 more. The reason I wanted an odd number is that it allowed me to duplicate the middle block all the way down the length of the bed to create a 16-inch wide access path down the middle with equal growing area on both sides. That requires 35 more blocks, again at just about $2 each, which adds another $70 of cost. Concrete blocks will stay put under their own weight. I don't need to think about cross braces or having corner brackets or anything like that. And then because the concrete block comes with these holes in it, those act as kind of a receptor for my PVC arches that are coming in, and I don't need hardware to support any of those either. The cost of those blocks altogether comes to just over $160. If I had gone with 7 blocks at each end for the 9-foot wide option, it would have been only $8 more. All in, it's still less than the wood option. Now, there are a couple of ways to make either the wood or the concrete block versions cheaper. I did choose to use pressure-treated lumber as my example here because I wanted kind of an apples-to-apples comparison as far as durability. You certainly could use regular lumber. I know some people are concerned about using pressure-treated. If you did that, the total cost of the bed would drop by about $50 and would bring it right in parity with the concrete. Worth noting, though, that there's also a way to make the concrete block version cheaper, and I've actually done that so far as a bit of a placeholder, and I'm discovering that it might work long-term. The best way to make the concrete block beds cheaper is to not run concrete blocks continuously down the aisle. For now, I have placed blocks intermittently, about every 4 feet, and then I have my arches just landing in that concrete block. The rest I have filled in with wood chips for now, and it seems to be working pretty well. I think long-term, I probably will continue to add more and more of those concrete blocks because I like the defined edge. But for now, this works perfectly well, and if you wanted to start the same way, you definitely could. The cost advantage matters, but what really changed my decision because of this property is the adaptability. I have already changed the layout of this garden significantly several times as we have settled on the property and built it out, primarily because of limitations in zoning laws. I had originally planned on growing things like potatoes or onions outside of the main garden, and I'm not able to do that. Pulling all of that inside changed the size of the beds that I needed, the number that I needed, my crop rotation planning. I've done a bunch of videos on that, but the broader point is just that I am probably going to end up changing this again. I will almost certainly need to have a different size of bed or a different configuration. And knowing that, I wanted to make sure that the effort and the work and the money that I put into this wouldn't be wasted. The thing about wood is that you can't uncut it. In theory, I could always, disassemble the beds and try and reuse the lumber, but the odds of the pieces being the right size for the new configuration are very, very low, and I would almost certainly end up needing to buy more lumber. The concrete blocks are modular. I can put them in different shapes. They can go long and skinny beds, short and wide beds, T-shaped, cross-shaped, all kinds of opportunities. And worst case, if I changed my mind and said I no longer want to use concrete block in the garden, I could use them for completely different building projects. It's a standard building material that can be used in a multitude of ways. And overall, it made me feel better that I was less likely to waste a bunch of money on a solution that I then couldn't repurpose. Maintenance is also pretty straightforward as well compared to wood, and that's important. If these start to get out of alignment, I can just go ahead with a rubber mallet and kind of tap them back into line. With wood, over the years, I've definitely had to battle things like twisting or bowing, and that was much, much harder to fix. The other part about adaptability here is that the blocks themselves are multi-purpose compared to wood, even if I never rearrange them. I've shown a view here of 2 beds used for different types of crops. I already mentioned that the block holes can be used as support for the PVC arches for anything that I grow under cover, but they can also support vertical trellises for crops like tomatoes and squash that I like to grow that way. And this isn't just the holes in the blocks, this is also about the holes in between the blocks, as long as you buy the right kind of block. We have some concrete blocks that look like this. We have some concrete blocks that look like this, with just a little tiny notch on one side. And then we have quite a few concrete blocks that look like this. And when 2 of those blocks are put together, you can see you get this nice little cavity in between them. And I highly recommend that you use those blocks in particular, if you can find them, for the short ends of the bed. At the very least for the 2 blocks at each edge, so the 2 at this end and the 2 at that end, because they are perfect for holding a trellis. If you decide to use, like we did, 2x2 dimensional lumber for your trellis supports, they fit into those little slots quite nicely, and we just packed in a bit of dirt around it, and they hold them up structurally and have provided a ton of support for these trellises that are growing all of our melons and some tomatoes. Those trellised crops generally require pollination, which brings me to the third use. I can fill the blocks with soil and place shorter pollinator plants like sweet alyssum, clover, bee balm, or asters inside of them. I know which blocks would need to be kept open to receive PVC arches in future years with my 4-foot spacing of those arches, and I can leave those blocks empty, but otherwise I can go nuts with creating pollinator strips along the edges of the beds. The last criteria we used was effort, and I will say this is where the concrete beds are way, way worse. One of our prior wooden beds could have been assembled in, say, 15 to 20 minutes tops, but putting one of these beds together takes me a solid day. And because the blocks themselves are very heavy, the physical effort of unloading them, carrying them into the garden, getting them in place, adjusting them to get them square and all of that took a real toll. And I needed to stop and take at least a half day, if not a full day of rest after only doing 1 or 2 beds. Granted, I am middle-aged, but even if I had tried to do this in my 20s, I don't think I could knock out 10 beds one day after another for 10 days straight without needing some serious rest and recovery time. If you are a beginning gardener and just starting out, stick with wood. I think that the physical effort and the strain of trying to do this approach might turn you off of gardening completely, and that would be a shame. I would say start with wood to begin with, and then if you find over time that, like me, you are fully vested and you really want to start growing a lot of your own food, then I would say this approach merits serious consideration because the rewards outweigh the effort. Finished product. It never looks quite as nice in reality as it does in that, perfect little world of SketchUp, but I am pretty happy with this. This particular bed has 2 trellises down the 2 growing areas, as you can see. Mixture of spaghetti squash and tomatoes for the most part. I did go ahead and place the CMU blocks down the middle, just like I did on the bed where I'm building those arches. I don't need them for this particular bed, but I thought I would just place them all now, and that way next year, if I grow something in the bed that does need that coverage, I'm not figuring it all out from scratch. This way, I've got that consistent aisle and the spacing, and everything is locked and loaded. But yeah, you can see I'm pretty happy with this. If anybody else has tried building raised beds out of concrete blocks, I'd love to hear how it went for you and if you have any tips or tricks, as well as from anybody that has scaled up gardening and is growing a lot of their own food and has found a different style of bed that you find to be effective. If you can post those comments or links to your own videos or anything that you think might be helpful to others in the comments below, I would love to see them, and I look forward to reading them and responding. Otherwise, until next time, I hope this one was helpful. Thanks.